All right, I'll start again since nobody heard that. Welcome to the fourth event of 43 at this year's Red May 2021, which is our fifth year. My God, unbelievable. Before we get into, I introduce today's event, I want to tell you what's up on the calendar for the next few days. We start going into the two events a day mode now. It gets really intense. Today at 4 p.m., Red Nation Rising, From Border Down Violence to Native Liberation, with Chris Latreille, David Correa, and Jennifer Nez Dennett-Dale. At 11 a.m. tomorrow, Survival and Resistance Mutual Aid in Disastrous Times. These, by the way, are Pacific times. The speakers tomorrow, Adrienne Marie Brown, Chandan Reddy, Dean Spade, Clee Benally, and Naomi Klein. And then on Saturday, we have the pièce de résistance, sort of Michael Heinrich's talk. Nope, I got it wrong. I'm sorry. I forgot on Friday, May 7th at 3 p.m. What we talk about when we talk about Marx, with Jason Smith and Paul Maddock Jr., the editor of Field Notes in the Brooklyn Rail, one of the best sources of a sense of the current moment. And then Saturday morning at 11 a.m. is Michael Heinrich's talk on the politics of value form analysis. Michael has never talked particularly about the politics of that before. So this will be kind of a revelation to many of us who are waiting to hear what he'll have to say. Do come to that. Now, how do we manage to put on this ridiculously intense and vast festival? Well, we do it in donations because there are no institutions that fund a festival with slogans like "Be a commie for a month" or "Take a vacation from capitalism." Capitalism lacks a sense of humor, as everybody knows. So we depend on your sense of humor and your generosity. And how can you manifest that? Well, you can go to redmayseattle.org under donate, and you could become a Patreon member, give us a monthly donation. Or you can go to our GoFundMe at Fan the Flames of Red May. So those are your options. But onward now with today's event, a real abstraction in the mind, but not from there. This is based on a book from Verso, edited by Gean Moreno. I set the book aside so I could raise it up and show it to the camera. Oh, good, Sven's got it there. But looking around my office at all the piles of books, I'm literally benumbed, and I can't find anything. But this book sort of arrived providentially, just as I was asking myself the question, does everything have to be Deleuze? Evidently not here. Let me introduce you the narrator, sorry, not fiction, the moderator of this panel, Johanna Goss, an old friend, who is assistant professor of art, history, and visual culture at the University of Idaho, and executive editor of Media and Journal of the New Media Caucus. So Johanna, take it away and introduce the rest of our panelists.
Thanks, Philip. Greetings, Red May. I'm coming to you from Seattle. We have panelists hailing from around the world: Vancouver, Miami, Utrecht. I'm thrilled to be here for what's bound to be a very juicy discussion of real abstraction from three leading experts on the topic: Gean Moreno, Jali Monsoor, and Sven Ludekin. I'll introduce each of the speakers in order before their opening remarks. And we're going to start with Gean, who is the editor of the book in question, In the Mind, But Not From There, which, as Philip just mentioned, was published by Verso in 2019. So Gean is, in addition to being the editor of the book, he is the director of the Knight Art and Research Center at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Miami. He is also part of the institution's curatorial team and has most recently organized exhibitions on the work of Ettore Sottsass, Terry Adkins, and Thomas Esson. He was an advisor to the 2017 Whitney Biennial and the 2018 Creative Capital Summit. So I'll turn things over to Gean for his opening remarks, and then we'll move on to the next panelists. Gean.
Thank you, Johanna, and thank you everyone else, Sven and Jaleh and Stephen for setting everything up, and Phil for the invitation, and everyone for showing up. So I just thought in my opening remarks, I could just set up the scene of when and why the anthology came to be. And so what I'm going to talk about might seem a little bit like ancient history after a pandemic and the Trump years and after Ferguson and all this. But there was a time, if you can believe it, when things like sentient matter and object-oriented ontologies and network everything, it just seemed to be invading art discourse and art exhibitions. And we were hearing about complicity with anonymous materials and objects that spoke to each other and left us out of the conversation and things like that. And it's not that these things in themselves seem, it's not that I even have the kind of background to critique these things in their disciplinary spaces, but in the art world, I can certainly speak to them, and I could speak to what happened to them, which is these complex imbrications of knowledge production and apparatus, these complex ways of thinking, subatomic particles and superhuman forces, and the way they organize reality in the art world. They just became ways to remystify objects, right? So these objects that we saw on pedestals or sitting on the wall or in dark video installation rooms, they suddenly had access to this vastness, to this plenitude that was beyond human conceptual apparatuses, that were beyond any structural determination. They were just beyond us. And this seemed a little bit silly, right? And just to put this in even broader context, this is the time when people like Graham Hartman are all of a sudden invited to do all kinds of catalog essays, where Tim Morton is invited to every panel discussion everywhere in the art world. And so in just looking at this, it just seemed to me that this mystification of objects was just kind of looking for a way to not speak about what was happening on the ground. And I think what was happening on the ground was that art objects themselves were being put through processes that maybe were new for them. They're being used as acid categories in portfolios, or used as loan collaterals. They were moving, the capital they were supposed to embody was being circulated without the objects kind of leaving collectors' walls or institutional walls. And all this seemed to me something that was being smoked over with these ideas of these objects that spoke to each other. Another thing that I think was happening at this point, especially after 2008 crisis, was the consolidation of these mega galleries, where it wasn't just that they were selling art, is that they were actually controlling information down to the point of building their own publishing houses. They were controlling price in a very draconian way. And I think most important of all is that they were not only controlling the movement of objects, they were actually controlling the movement of entire bodies of objects, right? So they love estates because of this. And what that does, I think, it controls the information and access to work. You don't even know what's available. So this is a way to kind of control price. I think a third thing that was happening on the ground was that art objects from young artists were kind of in these accelerated incubating periods, right? They just kind of walked out of an MFA studio to a $40,000 sale in the span of a month or whatever. And the last thing that I thought was really important that all this was smoking over was the fact that there were artists on the ground looking at these systems. There were, I would say, an artist like Blake Rain was looking at the evolving system in which his work was circulating and in which he was being made to circulate as a cultural producer. And there were other artists like Sam LeWitt who were actually looking at the materials that finance and data need, right? The actual materials, not these vibrant matter, conscious fluids or whatever. These were like the actual things that are in servers. So it was it was that. It was how the anthology arises in the moment of trying to think why, when all this is happening on the ground very concretely, the art world and exhibition spaces and institutions need and crave this other discourse of objects without us, let's call it. And so in this, I start kind of looking for who's thinking still through the legacies of critical theory. And in thinking of that, I think it seemed real abstraction as it came out of Marx, of course, and Sohn-Rethel was taking some kind of protagonist role in some of the discourse. And if it wasn't that, the real abstraction like that, it was things that came very close to it or sought in some way to think abstraction of something concrete, something that wasn't a distillation of an intellectual or mental distillation of empirical reality, but it was itself proposing that it was a reality that in turn created intellectual conditions or epistemic limits. And yeah, I mean, that's been a mouthful. So I think that gives us the idea of what was the setting for this. Yeah, I mean, I could stop there and then we could just parse that out if you want, or do some.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, Gean. And, I think we get a little taste of just how polemical and also how funny your introduction is. Your introduction has a really scathing tone. And in that spirit, that Marxist spirit of, humorous polemic, that is also, though, taking your interlocutors seriously in terms of their claims. I just wanted to read the opening couple of sentences before moving on to Jolly, because I want to just give credit to the tone that you strike here. So the book introduction begins, and I hope I'm not embarrassing you. In the last decade or so, the lockstep incursion of flat ontologies, notions of quasi-sentient matter, slime-lined and mushroom-sprouting vitalisms, and network everything into contemporary art discourse and exhibitions has been hard to miss. Embraced with steady fanfare, a slushy and exhilarating immoderate carnival of chemistry and composting across our discursive landscape has us querying the unfathomable inexhaustibility of objects, their capacity to pipeline unwieldy forces and transgress the tiny territory of the real available to human access. But as excitement for this vivacious and mud-splattered thinking spikes, ostensibly terraforming a new plateau from which to assess our cultural artifacts, skepticism tactfully summons sharpened attention. And it goes on. So I just want to put in a kind of moment of appreciation for the rhetoric that you have marshaled here in the opening introduction. And we can talk more about that also when we move to questions. But for now, I want to introduce our next panelist, Jolly Monsoor. She is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of British Columbia. And Monsoor's areas of teaching and research include modernism and the avant-gardes, European art since 1945, Marxism and Frankfurt School theory, and Marxist formalism. She has also acted as director of UBC's Critical Curatorial Studies program. Her book, Marshall Plan Modernism, was published by Duke University Press in 2016. And her current project is entitled Universal Prostitution, a Counter-History of Abstraction Crossing Modernism, 1888 to 2008, which is forthcoming also from Duke in 2022. So please welcome Jolly.
Thanks so much, Johanna. And good morning, everybody. So first things first, I'd like to acknowledge that my voice and my image is beaming from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, their ancestral territories, and that this primary plunder is the condition for the possibility of everything that we think, say, and do. And I'd like to thank with all my heart Philip Wohlstetter for inviting me again to Red May. I love Red May. I think it's just the most brilliant para-academic thing in the world, and I think everybody should support it. And I'd also like to thank Kyle Kubler, Sean Landis, Stephen Price for all their careful organizing and support. And I'd really like to thank Gean for including me in this fantastic volume, which is the inspiration for today's panel. I'm just amazed that I was asked to be part of that alongside a lot of thinkers and writers that I admire very much. I don't want to make any kind of formal argument in my 9 or 10 minutes. Instead, I'd like to offer a little bit of clarity around vocabulary. So really, what is real abstraction? How does it differ from abstract art or abstract thinking? First of all, who is Alfred Sohn-Rethel, the elephant, the figure looming over today's panel? Alfred Sohn-Rethel wrote this book, Intellectual and Manual Labor, which I carry all around town with me. I have it bound with a rubber band. It's all color-coded and everything. You too can download it off the internet, but it's recently been republished with a brilliant foreword by Red Mayer, Chris O'Kane. Alfred Sohn-Rethel is a figure associated, sort of a black sheep of the Frankfurt School. Adorno admired his thinking very much and cites him in Negative Dialectics, although Horkheimer disliked and persecuted him and wanted him out of the Frankfurt School and got his way. But luckily for us, Intellectual and Manual Labor was published in 1970. And as I mentioned, it's out again now. And this is the term real abstraction is one that Sohn-Rethel takes great pains to unpack and define in a very methodical way. In order to frame this a little bit, I should say that I think, or in my estimation, Sohn-Rethel's interlocutor or his horizon of interlocutorship is Kant and the Kantians. He's quite ambitious. He kind of wants to do to Kant what Marx did to Hegel. So Marx thought that the Hegelian dialectic was idealist. He wanted to set it on its feet, on terra firma, and say that our social relations are conditioned by the forces of production. And in turn, forces of production can be malleable to social relations if we collectively take them into our own hands. So what was Kant saying? Kant's definition of the Enlightenment is that it is self-liberation from self-enslavement using the special toolkit that we as a species have, which are our intellectual capacities and our critical and cognitive faculties. And Sohn-Rethel comes along and queries those epistemological categories by saying, well, wait a minute, those critical faculties and intellectual capacities are themselves informed by completely invisible material conditions issuing from the forces of production and circulation and consumption, and that there can be no such thing as self-liberation through intellectual capacity or cognitive faculties or intelligence or whatever, until we first acknowledge and avow those material conditions and work through them to see that they are the very foundation of free and autonomous thinking. So I'll just sort of go into my definition, but in order to try and concretize this for you, I'd like to share a couple of images. Everyone can see my screen? Great. Okay, so what is real abstraction? Real abstraction is quote unquote real, as opposed to what Sohn-Rethel calls thought abstraction held privately in the mind, insofar as real abstraction is the function of an action that takes place in external social space. Specifically, this space is the market, where goods and services are exchanged via currency. And in order to make his argument, and I can't get into this, I'll leave that to Chris O'Kane and others, Sohn-Rethel historicizes the value form. And so that's, I'll leave that to him. What I'd like to talk about here, and what I'm showing you with Gursky's Amazon, is that the market is far from the space-time of reflection or any form of self-reflexivity. It is situated among social relations and draws them, despite their heterogeneity, into its monologic, and its monologic is profit, invisibly structuring those social relations more than it is in turn affected by them. And it's abstract because it happens, quote unquote, behind the backs of men. That's Sohn-Rethel's term, and it'll be a refrain throughout my, my brief talk. It's very important, behind the backs of men, or what Sohn-Rethel calls the transactional space of the market that is indifferent to the lived trajectories of any of its actants. This transactional space is independent of and indifferent to any interest other than profit. Personal, collective, political, and ideological interests or affiliations become secondary at best. Transactional space is a materially interested, socially disinterested moment that happens where and when the commodity or labor power is valorized. So we could think of it as the polar opposite of Kant's definition of the artwork, which is purposive purposelessness. So if art is purposive purposelessness, the space Sohn-Rethel is describing is a materially interested, socially disinterested space. This kind of abstraction takes place in the exterior space of social necessity as opposed to any subjective interiority dialectically responsive to a social field. It is not the abstraction of thought, of cognition, or even of perception. As such, it describes a real yet unconscious space, although this unconscious is not the unconscious posited by psychoanalysis. And if I can just make a little brief aside, it strikes me, if one were to really take Sohn-Rethel's thinking to its farthermost outer limits, that it's really a kind of rival to many models of the unconscious coming from psychoanalysis, especially the Jungian model of the collective unconscious. So if I can, oh, I never started my, there. Okay, so we had that, now we have this. This form of transaction comes to act as a source of unconscious social synthesis, necessitating and structuring social experience and social relations regardless of any personal, individual, or collective intention. At the same time, because it occurs outside of any content-specific experience with things or others, it is unrecognized as a social synthesis. It happens behind the backs of men, and it is utterly invisible. It happens in a logic set by value and its relation to price, in which no intention can intervene. So even the intention of the capitalist can't intervene, right? The market has its own laws. One way to think about this for art historians of the longue durée and people who like to look at images is that it accomplishes the kind of social synthesis. The market actually accomplishes the social synthesis that the Catholic Church had historically hoped or expected to accomplish via the Eucharist, Holy Communion, forming a social coherence and consistency. So I'm showing you on my left, your right, Raphael's Disputa from 1510, which is a way of organizing all of heaven and earth around Holy Communion, around the Eucharist. So everything on earth is organized neatly along the x-axis of this grid, and everything in relation to eternity and infinity is neatly organized along the y-axis, God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. all of us are capable of becoming part of this divine order if we move through the Eucharist, which is at the apex point or the vanishing point of the single point perspective, composing Raphael's painting. And Gursky is very much in conversation with the longue durée or the long historicity of painting. If anyone wants to look him up, that's kind of what he's doing. And he's explaining or explicating via his own grid, the X and Y axes that organize all of our experiences and that condition all of our everyday social life behind our backs. What marks modern and contemporary capitalism from historical market exchange economies is both the capitalist mode of production, which creates abstractions among actual social relations through atomization, anonymity, and repetition, and the redoubled abstraction of transactional space that in turn valorizes or consummates the productive forces while also setting patterns of consumption. This two-part mechanism specific to the capitalist mode of production doubly enforces separation, both at the level of the internal division of the agent from his or her labor, as from the commodity. How does it do this? Because the space and moment of transaction negates all intention, or what we could call as shorthand, the bourgeois idea of free will and self-determination, because it is motivated by an autonomous logic, that of price, profit, and circulation. This other place, driven by an autonomous, automated metabolic, takes place behind the backs of men, suspending all intention, affect, family, kith, kin, politics, etc. It is indifferent to both production and consumption, other than as these affect the relation between value and price. The impersonal vectors of the market determine that, which happens, I'm sort of going to skip over this because it's getting a little bit repetitious. The point is that it cancels community. The operations, the transactional space of the market that occurs behind the backs of men in this socially unconscious space cancels community and replaces it with community's capitalist unconscious. To emphasize, this unconscious space is not that theorized by psychoanalysis. It is simply that which motivates any collective under capitalism despite their self-present intentions. The space of transaction, to repeat, is anonymous, impersonal, and impervious to any kind of experiential consciousness. The reason that Gursky's image is especially relevant, I think, is that Sohn-Rethel locates the operations of the market as the source of a primary division between intellectual and manual labor. So here we are, all these books in the Amazon warehouse. They're all lined up here to be packaged and sent out. The contents of this tremendous load of intellectual labor is entirely beside the point for as much for Jeff Bezos as for all of the people who are packaging and working with these materials. So yeah, that's the end of my little book report on Sohn-Rethel. Suffice to say, in the words of Michael Eby in Tribune magazine, that the book situates capitalism as a set of, quote, self-sustaining abstractions and impersonal compulsions, sedimented through thought and action, end quote. Now, the work of art enters this field of self-sustaining abstractions and impersonal compulsions in any number of ways across media. But as Johanna will probably remind us, the Duchampian ready-made is its earliest index. I could try to show you any number of artists who have tried to think about the structural condition of real abstraction in their practice. I could list any number of examples from Duchamp to Manzoni, Klein, Brothers, Warhol, performance art. Andrea Fraser stands out in particular. The Critique of Institutions, Hans Hacke, dedicated performance art, Santiago Sierra. And I do that. I take all of these figures and try and work through them to distinguish among forms of abstraction in a forthcoming work. I think for now, it's more useful to see what real abstraction isn't. Real abstraction is not abstraction. And ironically, what has been called abstract art, so, you know, who is the kind of greatest beacon of abstract art in the mid 20th century besides Piet Mondrian? It would probably be Jackson Pollock. And looking back on it in retrospect, it strikes me that the kind of abstraction that Pollock is engaging, discourses of opticality aside, is really a dialectical response to what Sohn-Rethel is calling real abstraction. So here he is, he's sharing authorship with gravity, right? The canvas has been put on the ground. The paint is answerable to these, you know, the contingency of physics. It's registering the somatic body, right? The Pollock dance, as it's been famously put. Some people have noted that the strokes, the dropping paint looks sort of ejaculatory. So that's a little bit too, I think, mimetic and representational for my purposes. But the point is that for many people, it seems to summon or evoke bodily functions. If you look at the painting up close, there are cigarette butts and detritus of studio life. So there's this kind of desperate attempt to summon the last remaining interstices of particular experience or concrete life, the dance, the body, nervous expression, smoking, gravity, horizontality. So if anything, this modality of abstraction might be thought of as a kind of answer to what Sohn-Rethel's real abstraction is. But if I have to put all my cards on the table, I would say that ultimately the work of art is straddling a complicated place between Sohn-Rethel's real abstraction and what he calls thought abstraction. So I'll stop sharing my screen now and leave it to you all to parse this out. I hope that those definitions made any kind of sense to our broader non-academic audience, which is why we love Red May. Okay.
Thank you, Jolly. I think that was a crystal clear distillation and provided so much rich points of contact and context for the discussion in particular. Thank you for that. I'll now move to our third panelist, which is Sven Ludecken, who teaches art history, and I'm going to not pronounce this correctly, at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. He is the editor of books including History in Motion, Time in the Age of the Moving Image from 2013, Cultural Revolution, Aesthetic Practice After Autonomy from 2017, and the forthcoming Objections, Forms of Abstraction, Part 1. He is the co-editor of the volumes The Futurity Report and Deserting from the Culture Wars, and the editor of the forthcoming reader Art and Autonomy. And I hope he'll forgive me for butchering the name of his university. So I'll turn things over to Sven.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Also, thanks to everyone who was involved with organizing this, and thanks to Gean and Jale for basically getting us where we are right now. And I'll just try to build on them a little bit. I'll try to be reasonably brief, perhaps by indeed returning once more to Alfred Sohn-Rethel. I also found myself going through the book once again in preparation of today's session. And And perhaps it would be rather interesting actually to look at one fairly central introductory passage near the beginning of his book or his books, because actually, yeah, the English version is really a different version from the German book, but still this is, this can be found in both versions. So in the English edition, he notes that Marx was the first to discover the commodity abstraction at the root of the economic category of value, and he analyzed it from the twofold viewpoint of form and of magnitude. The exchange process gives the commodity, which it transforms to money, not its value, but its specific form of value. So Marx states in the chapter on exchange, and then Sohn-Rethel continues, the form and the magnitude of value spring from different sources, the one from exchange, the other from labor. The critique of political economy hinges upon the understanding of how they combine to become the abstract human labor, constituting at once the form and the substance of value. So here we have exchange and labor, basically, and there is indeed a dialectical pairing of those two all through the first part, in particular, of Sohn-Rethel's book. So he has this focus on the exchange relation or the exchange process, or die Tauschhandlung in German, the act of exchange. So that is indeed the fundamental scene within the arena of this transactional space of the market that Jale discussed. So there's this focus indeed on exchange as a process, as an act. Then there is labor, abstract labor, labor power as the substance of value. But Sohn-Rethel has been accused for privileging exchange to some extent, exchange as ultimately indeed the realm of form, the value form. So this, of course, in the exchange relation, in this transaction, this is where this fundamental relation of the value form basically is articulated. So 20 yards of linen equal 1 coat, right? That's sort of the value form. That's the fundamental relational form of value. 20 yards of linen equal 1 coat, etc. And not an atom of matter ultimately enters into the commodity qua commodity, according to Sohn-Rethel. This is precisely where the real abstraction sort of comes into being, where commodities become compatible through the value form. Okay, so we have this dialectic of the exchange relation or the exchange process or the Tauschhandlung and abstract labor or abstractified labor as substance, as he calls it, abstraktifizierte Arbeit als Substanz. And actually, this also got me thinking then in terms of our discussion and our situation about different sort of trajectories, different iterations of the value form and different forms of artistic labor in the present, and particularly also now during the pandemic, so in the last year or so. So on the one hand, we do, of course, see the emergence of a particular type of mystified object or digital object as asset, so NFTs in particular, which we will be returning to later, of course, or at least I think we will. On the other hand, I know many artists who live in a different economy, right? Not the economy of NFTs, of artworks as digital assets, more the economy of rather precarious project-based work. They are selling something which may not quite be abstractified labor as substance. It may not quite be that abstract labor or labor power, but it is something that, their praxis, basically their practice is something that they seek to monetize. And of course, during the pandemic, even more so than before, they realized that, well, this was indeed a very sort of tentative and precarious commodity to sell, right? Because this project-based economy really took a severe beating. It really was hit quite badly by, for instance, residencies no longer being able to take place. So the whole economy within the project-based economy, the whole system of artists doing residencies. Well, that fell flat for the most part. So if indeed you are selling your presence, right, here you can also think of Hito Steyer's notion of economies of presence. If that is sort of what you have to sell, largely your presence, your practice as something that needs to take place within certain spaces in certain locations, by organizing workshops or participating in workshops or what have you, not just on Zoom, but linked also to residencies, then the gap becomes rather wide, right? So this class system within art becomes really extremely visible and palpable, right? And of course, we've known for years that there isn't, basically, to talk in terms of systems, there isn't one art system or one art world necessarily with one uniform model of what constitutes art and what constitutes an artwork. But indeed, there have been more object-based economies of art, more project-based economies of art, with different different iterations, perhaps different mutations of the value form, linked to objects, linked to digital files logged in a blockchain, for instance, linked also indeed to an artist's direct presence in a certain location and their participation in projects that require presence. Of course, also the very, it's not just sort of the living in a certain residency, being part of a residency program, but also then actually making work as part of that residency and exhibiting it in an exhibition that can actually be visited by people. That also became problematic, which is, yeah, a problem that the NFT seems to avoid rather neatly. So I'm interested here in sort of divergences, we might say, between, on the one hand, indeed, a particular type of value form in art, or a particular iteration of the value form in art that indeed depends on an exchange process or a version of Sohn-Rethel's Tauschhandlung that has also now been outsourced, let's say, to the blockchain, that doesn't require a meeting in a physical transactional space, right? The transactional space itself has been deterritorialized, if we want to use a Deleuzian term, after all, sneakily. So there is that sort of further autonomization, we might say, of the transactional space of the market and of the exchange relation. And on the other hand, there's the question, indeed, that's hovering over whatever passes for labor in the realm of artistic, but also, of course, yeah, academic or para-academic practice, right? So what is actually the value of our labor, let's say, right? Well, today here, with Red May, of course, we're all volunteering, which is also quite two-sided, I would say, a rather ambiguous phenomenon within today's precarious project-based economy, because on the one hand, we seem to escape from this space of exchange, but of course, we're also in one way or another, probably still, working on making sure that our stock doesn't drop too far, right? There is such a thing as symbolic capital, and then question how that can be transmuted into other forms of capital. So I just want to basically end here now with this scene of us here also on Zoom in our respective windows, but also being able to connect from one window to another on this platform, courtesy of Silicon Valley. We are, of course, also, working for Zoom, just as we are working for Facebook without wages. So there are all these, let's say, dimensions to the accelerating, constantly mutating problem of value and of the value form in art and elsewhere. And I think Sohn-Rethel, for all the seemingly obsolete, somewhat archaic features of his thinking and of his references, I think Sohn-Rethel is still incredibly useful, still has phenomenal use value when it comes to trying to find our bearings and think through these issues and our own positions and practices. So I'll end for now on that note.
Thank you, Sven. Again, incredibly rich presentation with lots to pick up on, discuss. Do either Gean or Jolly want to respond to Sven's remarks now, or his provocations, or sort of, I think, embedded in his remarks, tying into his contribution to the book, kind of looking towards an updating, or perhaps trying to bring Sohn-Rethel into the present and understand how we might discuss these sort of questions of value today in the late digital age. Does anybody want to discuss or take up some of Sven's provocations, or we could move into some of the discussion questions?
Perhaps actually, perhaps I could share screen really briefly.
Yeah.
I actually was thinking of indeed to have at least something to show, some image to show, even if it's an abstract image. I was thinking of sharing this, which is maybe something that I show and discuss too often. It's almost a kind of talisman of mine, because I think it's such a fantastic reflexive engagement with these questions by the artist Natasha Sadar-Hagigian. This is basically an essay that she wrote with the title, and this is the title page, "Dear Artfacts, Look at My Curve." So this is her responding to the website, this online aggregator Artfacts, which basically aggregates all these data about artists' careers, about exhibitions and so on. And then they have a certain algorithm. Okay, if you have a solo exhibition, that counts for so much, and a group show for so much, etc., and an article, a review, etc. And then Natasha noticed that her curve on Artfacts was going down. You know, apparently her career wasn't going too great. And she uses that then actually to also challenge this form of this kind of portrait of her, basically a kind of algorithmic portrait of her and of her practice, her career. She is indeed an artist who has, I guess to her detriment in this case, who has also focused on all kinds of collaborative projects. She has worked in all kinds of also activist coalitions, the NSU Komplex Auflösen, for instance, People's Tribunal in Germany, which challenged sort of the state's implication in neo-Nazi racist murders. Well, all that doesn't show up, you know, in her career, according to Artfacts, even though I would argue that it is very much part of her practice, of her artistic or aesthetic practice. But yeah, here we see basically, you know, what actually doesn't, what's not really counted, right? What doesn't really count as a value generating activity for, in this case, artfacts.net, I think it is, or .com. And here indeed, Natasha raises the question also of other criteria and other forms of value that should be taken into account. So yeah, just as a little further concretization, perhaps.
No, I think that's a great example. I want to just let the audience know that we'll now start accepting questions, and they can be sent to the moderators through YouTube or through Twitter or whatever platform you're viewing this on. So please start sending in questions. We're going to now open up the discussion amongst the panelists. I've prepared a few questions. I appreciate that kind of, concrete example. I'm going to share my screen quickly and just put up this image of the book for us, and Sven will notice that I've kind of stolen an image from his website of the table of contents, which is not the full table of contents, but does include both of our panelists' contributions as well as Gean's. I'm just gonna, just one moment, because I'm gonna have to end my show and there we go, it's still, I'll just keep it in that form. So the first question that I'm kind of returning to the conceptualization of this collection, really. And I'm thinking again back to Gean's introduction and trying to get a handle on sort of why this collection was sort of initiated, and also its role within the discourse currently in contemporary art, and also just sort of humanities, academia more generally. So Gean, in the introduction, you write that sort of this flood of new materialist discourses into contemporary art could be a compensatory mechanism in response to the financialization of the art world. And as I read with quoting from your introduction, you kind of, not gently, I would say, quite convincingly mock the overwhelming impact of Deleuzian thinking and new materialism. And you write, quote, "In light of the financial abstracting of the artwork, one of the numerous abstractive processes is faces before algorithmic governmentality, the proliferation of instruments engineered to capture future value, and the emergence of new policy and legal frameworks. What could be more enticing than the object that overruns mere semantic mysteriousness to become an autonomous agent, a thing in itself of sorts that is crashed into phenomenal reality, heavy with qualities that manifest beyond what we can grasp, with dimensions that exceed the limited things we can comprehend." And so reading this and keeping in mind your notion of this sort of compensatory function, it brings to mind critics of new materialism. I'm thinking specifically of the intellectual historian Timothy Brennan, who's just published a new intellectual biography of Edward Said, who has argued that the rise of new materialism in the humanities is not just compensatory, but is actually a function of its ideological compatibility with the economic and political imperatives of the neoliberal academy. And Brennan goes so far to state that the influence of the left Hegelian tradition, in which he situates Bloch and Lukács, but I'm also thinking kind of about Jaleh's remarks on how Sohn-Rethel's role within the Frankfurt School here as well. Brennan states that the left Hegelian tradition has really been suppressed in favor of what he calls, quote, "a Foucauldian and Heideggerian common sense, which fits more naturally with the predilections of American professional aspirations," end quote. And he also, of course, cites just sort of a blanket anti-communist tenor of the Cold War and after, and a tacit acceptance of the failure of socialism amongst liberal left academia more generally as fueling this suppression. So this is all to say, Gean, I want to ask you to comment a bit more and expand on, as well as Jaleh and Sven, how the rise of new materialism is perhaps not just a compensatory response to financialization in the art world, but also offers an ideological alibi for this intensely financialized situation and becomes a way to divert discussion away from questions of exchange and capital and keep us talking about these mystical objects, even as you say, the art object sets capital in motion and puts it to work. And then I'm hoping also Jaleh and Sven will chime in about not just the art world, but also the academy more broadly. And I'm thinking about, Jaleh's training at Columbia, where, of course, the left Hegelian tradition, I think, is not actively suppressed per se. So that's a long-winded way of asking you to talk a bit more about sort of the inspiration for this collection and what it's responding to.
Yeah, I think, in the art world, it's probably even more aggravated in that what we got was the weaker flank, or what we used to call speculative realism, right? So Ray Brazier, who, is a much more complex figure, is not, it's marginally appears in the art world, but it's these other kind of easier discourses that really come in. And it just feels like there was no real mechanism of counteraction. It just felt like it was a discourse that institutions, who of course had taken this neoliberal turn, could embrace quite easily and did. And I think one of the things that we haven't touched on is that climate and the Anthropocene, in the way it was thought about in the art world, also provide an alibi for these discourses, right? So you don't talk about climate the way you talk about a pot, right? You talk about climate as this aggregated, multi-sided thing. And so that was easily translated into something like hyperobjects. And so since the Anthropocene in the art world was kind of thought in almost symbolic terms, right? It was a thing of that you needed to represent somehow. these discourses gave you, a way to represent through a pseudo complexity these things, right? So it's kind of like you talk about the object as this thing that had dimensions you can engage, right? The way climate maybe happens, between your AC and the ozone layer or something like that, right? And so I think that this was just so climate provided an alibi for these things to go, but then these things provided the institutions an alibi to seem to be to propose that they were doing something critical about climate, about non-human relations, right? And in all this, maybe not at this moment in which the ontology comes in, but as we move further, then one starts thinking of what other discourses these institutions are going to start, siphoning in, right? When we start talking about non-human relations and this sort of thing, what is it that these institutions are going to, how is it they're going to appropriate these discourses? And I think this is, so it's compensatory, but I also think it's a weaponized tool for these institutions to portray criticality while in the back end, just assuming very kind of neoliberal, these are institutions whose boards are collectors, who are in cahoots with these galleries. I mean, this is a structure in the back end that is quite attuned to the way a globalized neoliberal world works. And these discourses and what they allowed created a front end, right? A public facing space that seemed critical, right? That seemed to be engaged in some kind of discursive criticality, which in the art world at least seemed like it's a very thin veneer that you could easily puncture through. I don't know if that was helpful to what you were asking, but
yeah, the thin veneer, considering the flights that that people in the art world engage in across the world. Jale, please.
Yeah, if I can chime in, Johanna, I think the answer to your question is in the question, but you're kind of generously mobilizing the language with hopes that we'll bite at the bait. So I guess we will. I agree with Gean that the art world has stopped thinking for a very long time. The relationship between some of the more interesting art practices that Gean mentioned and the discourses around them, that gap grows ever wider and wider and wider. So Sven mentioned the seeming obsolescence of Sohn-Rethel's matrix or his language. And it strikes me that it's really the other way around, that discourses around art have really exhausted the limited capacity of the problem of technology. They've really exhausted the last reserves of a Heideggerian framework. And so Sohn-Rethel kind of rides in on his stallion to give us another kind of language for thinking about the way in which technology itself is first and foremost a social technology, that beneath all the data and so on and so forth, that social relations had to be organized in a particular way in order for the cybernetic turn and the sort of issues around surveillance and data control to occur. And so, the art world, and again, there are numerous art worlds, but the kinds of new materialist discourses that Gean is responding to, I think were rallied not because they had any truly motivated relevance to interesting art practices, but because the discourse had just sort of fallen asleep. And these things sounded, nominally smart for 2 minutes. And then, everyone sort of burned out on them and got bored by these trends and came to their senses. But I think the reason that Sohn-Rethel is especially motivated now, it's not, just another turn in the discourse or another trend or another name drop or fashion, but is something really motivated by our historical conditions with zeal and energy, is that the more that the quote unquote art world tries to collapse the work of art into a financial instrument, which is what the NFT is. It's taking Duchamp's very kind of complicated dance with money and completely short-circuiting and collapsing it so that the artwork is the same thing, is homologous more or less with money. But the more and more that the quote unquote art world, financialized neoliberal conditions attempt to do this, the more the work of art withdraws. So Gean mentioned Blake Rain, for instance, whose work I shouldn't say this because, the aforementioned Hegelians that Johanna mentioned would strike me dead for using the B word, but I do think Blake Rain's work is utterly beautiful. And it does what it does because it internalizes the problems of the market and real abstraction and completely withdraws from them. So it does what Denis Ollier, maybe summoning Maurice Blanchot, would call the use value of the impossible. The more you try and corner the artwork to be a quote financial instrument, the less and less it's going to do that, because it's going to negative dialectically perform if it's an artwork worth its salt and not just an artwork. It's going to completely withdraw from that, which is what I think Sven was demonstrating with Natasha's work. It can say, oh, dear art fucks, here's my stock. Here I've gone up, I've gone down. Here are all my charts and my graphics. But the more she presents that, the more the viewer starts to understand, hey, wait a minute, the real bulk of the matter, the content, the juice isn't something that can be charted along these lines. So that's just what I think about the problem of obsolescence of this language. And what I think is happening in the quote unquote art world is that it's beginning to realize that it lost the reins of a motivated historicity, and it needs to sort of wake itself up. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, maybe I could chip in if that's okay, Johanna. I almost said Johanna, but I've learned not to do that. No, I think there's a really important point here in that, of course, the sort of the return of Sohn-Rethel, if you will, I think indeed needs to be distinguished from a kind of trend economy. I think it does come out of a historical engagement with Sohn-Rethel and with Sohn-Rethel as a historical thinker, even if, of course, he can also be excessively schematic and all that. But part of the whole problem also, one problem of the whole sort of the clusterfuck of problems that was speculative realism and new materialism, etc., was precisely that it wore its historicity and its anti-historicism, proudly on its sleeves, right? The history of philosophy itself was reduced to a kind of a ridiculous fairy tale about how there was this fall from grace with Kant, and then everything became correlationist, and then, okay, maybe some were exempt like Heidegger, but basically philosophy needed to be restored to its true sort of calling, philosophy as an ontological project beyond this sort of correlationist reduction and a reduction of philosophy to epistemology, etc. There was, of course, no place in that, cartoon narrative for any substantial engagement with Hegel and then with Marx sort of following on Hegel. That whole turn was completely disregarded, sort of the whole practical turn, if you will, a dialectical historical materialist turn. So, okay, we had this supposedly return to the aboriginal calling of philosophy, which was basically its memification, right? It was ontology as a memified thing that was compatible with a certain type of art jargon. And we have indeed the necessity that many feel and act upon to indeed think historically, and to also think about and act with indeed technology historically, for starters. So yes, I would agree that there is here a counter proposition, if you will, and a counter practice that, however, isn't necessarily triumphant across the board, I would say, right? I still see actually sort of that certain positions get a lot of traction, positions that I also wouldn't necessarily dismiss out of hand. But I see that, for instance, a certain kind of cocktail of Donna Haraway and Karen Barat and a couple of others thrown in, has incredible sex appeal, and I understand it. I would not. Again, I would not dismiss these authors out of hand, but I think it can also become sort of a strangely autonomous, once again, form of theorizing that is not too dissimilar ultimately from, the thinking of Timothy Morton, right, who also isn't a completely useless idiot or completely useful idiot, to use the Leninist term. In contrast to somebody like Graham Harman, I do see some also use value in some of Graham Harman, but it is essentially the mystification of what it should be, right? It is a mystifying version of what the actual analysis should be, and it can really take you somewhere if you, for instance, read Graham Harman in conjunction with Frederick Jameson, in conjunction with Sohn-Rethel, etc. So this kind of critical engagement, even with those kinds of positions, I think, should also be part of, let's say, of our project, right? The point, I think, is not to defend some kind of extremely narrow canon and, to be sort of the good people with the right reading list, right? I think some of the bad stuff or some of the dubious, problematic stuff should very much also be on the reading list. But we can then read, for instance, Timothy Morton with Sohn-Rethel, and we can indeed historicize, and we can actually think about correlationism differently, and we can sort of see how Sohn-Rethel's account of how the Kantian thought form actually is correlated to the value form. We can see how that relates to those kinds of new materialist and speculative notions. And I think that's when things actually can become sort of even more productive than if we were to say, okay, there's the good, there's the sort of the armies of the devil, and here we are as the forces of good, which is possibly true enough, but I think we also need to actually get the kind of conversation going and the kind of critical exchange going. We need to get the kind of critique going that actually the other side is not interested in and has never been interested in, right? So even though Timothy Morton isn't interested in that, or Donna Haraway at this point may not be terribly interested in that anymore in her earlier work, yes, perhaps, it is incredibly important to actually also perform that type of critical labor. So, sorry, this is probably a long ramble.
No, it was very clear and really a precise response. Gean?
Yeah, I was going to say that what you said, Sven, is right. I think the operation of bringing these discourses was precisely to not allow what you said should happen to happen, right? It was precisely the operation of shoving the other discourses and even the engagement between the discourses to the side, and using these, somehow giving these new discourses all the space. And of course, it's also because I think these discourses also provided very easy tools for curatorial practices of a certain sort and for certain studio practices. So it was, so what you're saying might be so, that there should be this complex entanglement of discourses that don't go together. I mean, that's another question, whether that should be or not. But what I do want to point out is that these discourses were broad and favored in the art world precisely so that that didn't happen. So, I mean, yeah.
Of course, absolutely. I agree. I guess what I'm saying is that, but this may be an unpopular position, and perhaps it's a foolish or foolhardy position, but I guess what I'm saying is that, we, or people like myself, should be the grown-ups in the room in this respect, when it comes to actually sort of performing this labor, when we think that there might actually be something to be gained from it, So indeed, with Graham Harman, I think I've said what I need to say, and I don't want to ever read Graham Harman again, right? I'm not saying that needs to be done every single time.
Maybe to return to Sohn-Rethel here, the question isn't so much about which discourses are good or which discourses are bad, but the question is why? Why did the quote art world, which was once so vibrant with interesting critical debates, with high stakes and people who had convictions, why did that stop? Why did that collapse such that, these other kinds of these attempts to bring to bear an interesting kind of language, as unmotivated as it might have historically been, why did these become so popular? And I think at a certain point, and I remember one of the things that Bruno Latour had said is that it's time to get past criticality. It's time to stop being critical, which intuitively is like a stab in the heart for me. That doesn't make any sense. I've been trained to understand that any kind of respectful engagement a priori has to have some degree of criticality, or it's just a kind of a kiss off or an affirmation. But why did this happen? And I think my sense of it from reading Sohn-Rethel again and again is that at a certain point, the sort of light bulb got switched on, which is that it's really impossible to be creative in any kind of naive sense in the face of the forces of production. And so my sense, and I think a lot of artists are working through this, including Blake Rain, Claire Fontaine, and I could rattle off a number of them. I think the question is where the margin of quote unquote creativity or negativity or autonomy comes from that might work against a totally affirmative matrix. I think it's getting harder and harder for artists to offer something in the totally saturated space of production, and both the space of production and the sphere of transaction in the market. And as fewer and fewer artists are able to kind of give us a convincing praxis, right, the discourse begins to follow along with that and say, okay, criticality is out of vogue, it's passé. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not so much about good discourses or bad discourses, but what are the historical conditions that have made the emergence of convincing propositions, either in the form of an artwork or in the form of discourse about an artwork, become more and more rarefied?
I'm not sure, if I agree fully, because on the one hand, yes, if we look at it in terms of the proportions, you're right. But it is a process of marginalization, right? It is a process of marginalization within an expanding field and a diversifying field. I see many interesting critical propositions in artistic practice. They don't necessarily get written about in glossy magazines. I'm sure you know many. That's patently clear. So I think it is a process of marginalization in what has become one segment of the cultural industry or the creative industries. And let's not be ahistorical ourselves. And let's not present this as something that's completely unprecedented. Let's remember, for instance, that in the 1980s, there was also a phenomenal sort of anti-critical movement with the new painting, abstract expressionism, then with the whole the whole Baudrillard bubble of the 1980s, right? Everybody was into Baudrillard, and Baudrillard was used in a pretty similar manner compared to how those more recent authors have been used in the art world. Think of, a curatorial practice such as Collins and Milazzo in New York in that period. I mean, there are many parallels, and more than parallels, precedents, I think, were created there. We can really see antecedents. So it's not completely unprecedented in times of sort of economic boom or in times of economic bubbles that the more critical practices get marginalized and sidelined. And I would say that even originally a project such as October's, right, was created at such a moment. They felt this process of marginalization viscerally, and they created October as a counter proposition. So we see those moments time and again. Perhaps one problem is now that the process has been intensified to the point where it becomes difficult to even, generate a certain degree of visibility for such practices, and to also really articulate them in a collective or collaborative manner to really make a stance. Perhaps it is all a bit too scattered and atomized, if you will. That might be one issue. I'd be curious to hear from the others about this.
I think this has been very engaging. I think because it's been mentioned so many times, we should move on to this sort of elephant in the room question about NFTs, the dreaded NFTs, the very polarizing NFTs that are being both dismissed and debated. And so I'm going to just move into the full slideshow here, noting that we've been not on full slideshow yet, to show this work by Beeple that has dominated much of the art press and debate, social media debate, as well as really sort of the higher echelons of art criticism. Speaking of October, Sven, so Jale has already mentioned sort of discussions around the indebtedness or the relationship between the NFT phenomenon and the ready-made. Writing recently in October, David Jozelit calls NFTs the ready-made reversed. And he notes that, quote, if Duchamp used the category of art to liberate materiality from commodifiable form, the NFT deploys the category of art to extract private property from freely available information. And by that, he's talking about the fact that this Beeple collage is essentially memes that are freely accessible, that have been compiled and collaged. And Jozelit continues that NFTs really arrest the fungibility of information. And in Beeple's case, that means the memes themselves, and rechristen them as art, and thus equates the category of art with non-fungibility, and deploys the category of art as the, quote, ideological mechanism by which previously mobile production of the artist Beeple is made into private property, susceptible to exuberant speculation. So Jozelit's really interested in how this connects to the legacy of the ready-made. Other commentators, including Tina Rivers Ryan, writing recently in Art Forum, compares the NFT to Yves Klein's Zone of Immaterial Pictorial Sensibilities from 1959 to 62, which, as many of, I'm sure you all know, involved the sale of documentation of ownership of empty space, of essentially air, the immaterial zone, and then sold that in the form of a check in exchange for gold. And then the buyer was invited to opt in to participate in an elaborate ritual in which the collector would burn the check and Klein would throw half the gold in the Seine. The ritual could be performed in the presence of an art critic or a distinguished dealer, an art museum director, and at least two witnesses to sort of verify this transaction or this transubstantiation. Klein insisted that the buyer did not truly own the zone of immateriality until they burned its receipt, at which the piece would be incorporated into the buyer's sensibility. and could not be resold. So in other words, the point at which the work would become non-fungible. So Ryan takes up the Klein model and says, by asking his collectors to immolate their receipts, Klein took his immaterial works out of circulation, leaving the buyer with nothing but a sensibility. In this sense, and she's comparing the NFT to Klein here, she says the NFT is the receipt's revenge, leaving its collector with nothing but an asset. And then she talks about that as the impoverishment of the category of art. So I'm bringing Joslet and Ryan into dialogue here to say between the ready-made reversed and the receipt's revenge, I was hoping I could ask the three of you to situate the NFT phenomenon against this concept of real abstraction. And noting, of course, that across the book, Duchamp's ready-made and Klein's certificates are both discussed and invoked in multiple chapters as sort of models for thinking through these questions. So an open-ended question about NFTs. And I'll stop my share now, if that's okay. Just so we can see all your lovely faces.
Since you bring up Yves Klein, I probably sound like a broken record to those who know me, but I do think that artists tend to sort of work in advance of what becomes obvious to everybody else in discourse later on. But I think that what Klein is doing is unconsciously acknowledging what Sohn-Rethel is talking about, that it's only the contract, it's only the space of transaction, whether we're all consciously invested in it or not, that synthesizes a social body. He's kind of the closet Catholic in Klein is very aware that moment of transubstantiation, as you put it, has, he's kind of summoning that long historical memory to point out that, all that was once Holy Communion is now the transaction, and all that was once community is really the social unconscious. And like that kind of homogeneous logic that was once institutionalized, that kind of monologic is that which binds us. I think to answer your question about NFTs and Joselet's notion of the reverse ready-made, I think in a way they're answering to what Sven pointed out, that we're at a moment of tremendous dispersal. There is no set of debates or single debate that is engaging to all of us. So suddenly NFTs come into this void, and they speak to the historical phenomenon of the internet. I mean, every single great seismic moment of change in the sphere of production, circulation, consumption seems to generate its symbolic forms. But we haven't really, the internet hasn't really given us something tangible. And so in this moment of scatter, voila, something that is a reflection, is self-reflexive to the internet. But again, as I said before, I think the more and more that, the forces of the market try and collapse the artwork into its financial aspect, the more the actual work of art will withdraw. But that's just my little negative dialectic.
Sven or Gean, do you have any thoughts to share?
Yeah, so I've just been thinking what shall I say about this withdrawal, and I think this is in the introduction. I say something like that the artwork then becomes internally cleaved. So even if the artwork itself as a proposal withdraws, or its conceptual apparatus about withdrawal, the artifact itself becomes uncoupled from that, and then can be as collateral or an asset or whatever, mobilized to do things that might be in absolute contradistinction to what the object purports to be about, right? So the object can be about the withdrawal. It could be like the opaque spot in the social unconscious. It could be, in a Negrian kind of mood. It can be part of the constitutive power of the multitude, whatever it wants to claim for itself. But then it's once as artifact, right? Once it's a painting on a wall or whatever, it itself can be mobilized. The capital it represents can be actually made liquid, and it can be used, right? Safari land owner can use loans against his collection to actually make more gas canisters. So what I think one of the things that is happening is that the object itself, it's, I say something like it has a snare built into it, right? Like the prey carries its own snare. And while it proposes certain things, outside of that proposal, it can be made to do and behave in ways that are not that proposal or against that proposal. And so the object itself is a bit split. Yeah.
Of course, one can also place NTFs into a history, not just limited to the cases of Duchamp and Klein, but also one can situate NTFs in a history of successive attempts, let's say, by the art world to limit editions and to make sure that new technologies would not mean that artworks using those new technologies would become let's say, as widely distributed as Hollywood films or records or what have you, right? So limited editions, control the number of copies, 3 copies for the market, 1 exhibition copy, 1 artist proof, that kind of thing. In a certain respect, it's almost it's almost sort of a schematic reduction. It's almost sort of the culmination of a lengthy history in the form of something that is almost so obvious and blatant that it actually does pose real problems, I think, also for critique, right? What is there left to critique here in the sense of to unveil the hidden workings, etc.? I mean, if anything, the real issue, I think, that is on the agenda now for years to come probably is the question of labor, right? So if value has apparently become so autonomous, then this also raises questions about the whole Marxian project of actually linking exchange value, the value form, to socially necessary labor time, right? As ultimately what produces value. So I think if prices and hence therefore also value have become so apparently so unmoored, then indeed, what about the value of labor, right? What is the socially necessary labor time for all kinds of types of precarious, artistic, academic, intellectual labor, and of course, many other types of labor that really do not seem to be remunerated all that well or consistently, right? So there is a real, I think, tension here. There is an actual genuine sort of accelerating and intensifying historical contradiction, that we're living through at the moment. And I think, yeah, on the one hand, it's all patently clear as far as it goes with NTFs. It is what it is. These prices have become largely autonomous, right? Sort of the automatic subject of value, but this actually should encourage us to put the issue of labor and beyond labor of praxis on the agenda all the more forcefully.
So with the remaining time, we have exactly a half hour left to get through our audience questions. So I had other questions, but I think we should really pivot to the audience. We've gotten a handful of really interesting questions that are really diving in quite specifically into Sohn-Rethel. So I will share with you the first of those now, and that comes from Conrad Hamilton, who's watching us, I think, on YouTube. And Conrad asks or says, starts, while I appreciate Gean's juxtaposition of OOO and new materialism with Sohn-Rethel, it's important to note that there's a naive materiality latent in Sohn-Rethel's system too, since his view that manual labor can serve as a transhistorical vector of emancipation a la Maoism implies a certain direct access can be spontaneously recuperated via labor. In any case, and here's the question, at what point can one perceive the art object beyond the determinants of real abstraction? Is this possible, or must it be subjected to deferment until the commodity form is abolished?
Good comment / question. I also think it's important to indeed remain critical when engaging with Sohn-Rethel, and I think the sort of transhistorical dimension of his analysis is at times a strength, but also raises many questions. I don't think we can fully enter into that now, probably.
But if the little that Sohn-Rethel wrote about aesthetic practices, what he mentions is that basically art forms are there to index the second nature that is produced. So I think what art objects can do is critically reflect on these second natures through the forms that it produces, right? So I mean, he mentions, he's talking about the turn of the Renaissance and this quest for proportion and things like this. So I think what art objects in a critical mode can do is figure out what these what are the signs of the second nature in relation to real abstraction, whatever it is that real abstraction mutates to in our time, or how it yeah, I'll leave it there.
Mm-hmm. So imminent critical practice, sort of working with and through the embodied and constantly enacted contradictions. Is that what you're saying, Gean?
Yeah, so I'm just reading the question now it's posted. So it says, so can we perceive the art object beyond the determinants of real abstraction? And I think that for Sohn-Rethel, it isn't a question of getting beyond the determinants of the real abstraction, but it's the way in which the object, the art object, as a critical artifact, can actually highlight and index this second nature, right? The processes that this second nature hoist on it.
Yeah, I think the point of, the purposively purposeless point of the artwork in time is just exactly its timeliness. So, you know, Klein starts with his contracts in the early 60s, and that takes off in a particular way. So I would answer Conrad's question in two ways. On the one hand, the work of art has an indexical function against time, which is what I hear Gean saying. On the other hand, I think it does what Sven alluded to earlier, is that it drives or it signals the accelerated contradiction in order to do what it's always done, to point out that there is some elsewhere beyond the contradictions of the present moment. But I guess that all makes me kind of hopelessly Hegelian, that we're tracking time here. But I don't think.
Sorry.
Yeah. No.
No, sorry, I agree, but I would add that perhaps it is also in part about creating partial and compromised and precarious elsewheres in the present, right? Sort of how to live, how to actually install yourself with others within these unfolding contradictions, and how to actually, right, in situationist terms, how to live rather than just survive, right? And that's, of course, also the point that Jale emphasized with the Natasha Sadahagigian piece. Of course, it is indeed about, very much about showing and advocating modes of living and working, right, forms of praxis in the present that are, you know, that do represent an alternative up to a point, to some extent, even though, of course, you know, she also is living under these present conditions and she needs to survive, she needs to have an income, etc. Obviously, neither she nor anybody else lives in some kind of beautiful beyond outside the reach of the value form, right? Obviously. But there are different, I would say, ways of living with the value form and living with and in real abstraction.
And that's why I think Sohn-Rethel is suddenly kind of popular, or why Sohn-Rethel has to return to Kant to sort of underline the point you make. So on the one hand, the work of art is indexed and, you know, slightly ahead of its time. On the other hand, as you say, it occupies time, and, you know, as Deleuze would say that, you know, about Kant, that it's with Kant that time is, quote unquote, out of joint. So the artwork is the index of, you know, again, ahead of these temporally accelerated tendencies, at the same time that it's utterly out of joint and occupies time to offer us some sense of what something else would look like. The thing is, though, that is my ultimate position as an art historian. I'm often concerned that at the end of the day, that's vaguely reconstructed Adorno, but hey, whatever. Who cares? I mean, if it is, it is. And no one is claiming to be new. So yeah, I agree with you.
That's a great segue to our next question, which comes from, I know both Jale and my dear colleague, Trevor Stark at the University of Calgary, who asks an art historically motivated question. Does Sohn-Rethel's thinking of the social synthesis provide tools for art history and theory to overcome the deadlocked debates about the commodity status of the artwork, in which the artwork is either wholly subjected to the category of the commodity or irreconcilable to the production of value in a strict sense?
My most brief and succinct answer to that would be that yes, but you know, if the notion of medium specificity had held sway for a long time, which had created the crisis out of which, say, October was born, that kind of thing, I think what it gives us is an expanded notion of reflexivity, in which medium, quote, medium specificity yields to market reflexivity. I think that's the whole point. And although Gursky is far, far from a favorite of mine, why I like that image of Amazon, because he's kind of taking the modernist grid and thinking through the conditions of visibility, visuality, opticality, all that sort of stuff, but making the frame be the market itself. And that's what self-reflexivity would even mean in the present, would be to take what happens behind the backs of men, as Sohn-Rethel puts it, and take that to be the conditioning, the very condition, the structural, the frame of the artwork. So yeah, I think that is what Sohn-Rethel affords us, is the language or the framework for a form of self-reflexivity that's a little bit more honest than limiting itself to the frame or even the institution. I mean, the critique of institutions is great and all, but it's all about superstructure and not about the forces of production so much, with the exception of Haka and Fraser, right, I'd say. So I think it does give us quite a lot. I defer.
I just reiterated the question in the chat for our panelists, for Gean or Sven, if they want to chime in. Getting past the deadlock.
Yeah, so we seem to be returning indeed to a certain either late or neo-Adornian or institutional critique affiliated notions of critical reflexivity, market reflexivity, etc. And I think those are still of great importance, particularly I think if one also acknowledges that there is this kind of diversification of fields and of types of markets or versions of the art market, and other markets as well, academic, para-academic, etc. There are also, I think, certain attempts to, let's say, go beyond classical notions of institutional critique and reflexivity by actually instrumentalizing institutions, right? And saying, okay, I want to use these institutions to actually enable projects that would otherwise not be possible, right? One could think of Tanja Bruguera and Jonas Stahl and artists such as that, who in a sense take institutional critique into a kind of institutional or para-institutional activism. One could also think of Kader Attia, who then, has funneled some of his income from his art into creating a decolonial space in Paris, La Colonie, which then had to close during COVID. Those are attempts to indeed come to some kind of arrangement, a critical, reflexive arrangement, with not a merely pragmatic arrangement with institutional structures and economic structures and mechanisms, which of course also deserve to be critically evaluated in turn.
So I'll move on to our third question, which is coming to us from Hector via YouTube. Hector asks if the panelists could suggest any ways that this category of real abstraction can be helpful for popularly explaining, or could be mobilized really to explain the structurality of something like structural racism. Thinking specifically, I think, of those two framing essays in the book, Gean, from Toscano and LaBerge.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, but I do think it might be a good problem of, when Sven was talking about putting discourses that maybe don't obviously come to mind together. I wonder what a Sohn-Rethel, Cedric Robinson side-by-side reading does. So I don't have a good answer for this, but I do think it's a good problem.
I think, if I can jump in, I think it's the problem. I'm living and working and practicing in a kind of local, regional, and national art worlds that is caught in the deadlock of identity. And I see these discourses chasing their own tails again and again and again. And my concern is, and maybe this also returns to Trevor's question of how this toolkit gets us past a deadlock. I really think that social justice and identity are not going to move forward until they're able to address the marketization of social of identity and social justice, and to address this kind of structural framework that happens because it happens behind the backs of men. It's utterly indifferent, as to whether you're indigenous to Central America or the Iberian Peninsula or North Africa, or what your relationship to the Middle Passage is, or the extent to which your own personal family history might be deeply imbricated in settler colonialism. So I think I'm out of my discursive limits, but I do think that Sohn-Rethel could be tremendously useful to the problem of structural racism social justice and identity politics by reminding us that a lot of the sources of oppression, repression, and exploitation are indifferent to those historical and political trajectories. And it's only when we confront that basic indifference that we can then move forward with social justice. So I think that the kinds of discourses that really interest me are the ones that put social justice and identity in dialectical relation with a Marxist analysis. So Nick Estes, Glenn Coulthard, Marianne Nicholson, I could name lots of people. But yeah, so to return to Trevor, that is, if I were in the social justice department rather than the art history department, I would bring this toolkit to bear to try and move that language forward, because right now it's stuck in, who's authentic, who's not authentic, who, this kind of thing of a kind of problematic return to essentialisms that frighten me a lot.
Yeah, I think this is like a really rich question, because I'm thinking if the Kantian transcendental subject is already kind of sprouts from the real abstraction, does then the kind of structure that Sylvia Winters unearths in Enlightenment discourse, does that sprout from real abstraction as well? So I think this is such rich territory. I just don't have answers about it. But the prod has really got me, thinking about this. What if the real abstraction is not right? So what if you don't draw the connection from the exchange relation to like a Kantian to the whatever the epistemic limits, how they manifest through European philosophy, but perhaps in relation to something like the underside of Enlightenment philosophy, right? The things, like I said, that someone like Sylvia Winters really kind of takes apart. So I think there is something there, but I think it's work to be done. Mm-hmm. I don't have an answer. But yeah.
I agree on reading Sohn-Rethel with Sylvia Wynter and with Denise Ferreira da Silva. Of course, that doesn't necessarily get us to the point right away that I guess the question was driving at, right? So how can this actually then result in sort of tools? I think there's still quite some work to be done in that sense. Now, I'm also really interested in the link between Marx and Hegel's philosophy of right and the whole dialectic of person and property, right? Personhood and property, which is of course intimately linked to slavery and white supremacism. So personally, that's something that I've been working with quite a bit, but that's actually more Marx than Sohn-Rethel, and it's even more Hegel, sort of a critical Marxian rereading of Hegel. So that takes us slightly away from Sohn-Rethel.
Well, it sounds like there might be a new book proposal on the horizon to talk about this very question. I want to turn or give the floor to Philip, because he's had a question for a while now. And then I think that will potentially be our last question. So Philip, take it away.
Yeah, I want to start by saluting Sven's open borders Hegelianism, which welcomes in inadequately formulated concepts and takes what's unthought in them and makes them part of this kind of larger process of thinking, which suggests that we can even use Timothy Morton, which is a wonderful example. I mean, we have this notion of hyper objects that are objects that exist at such a scale and affect us that almost imperceptibly that they disturb the notion of what our thing is. And yet in 180 pages of the book, there is, I think, one mention in a sentence of the hyperobject that gathers us all together here, which is what Marx calls capital, which is something that is perceptible only in its effects and which positivist economics denies. And again, to address what Gillet both and Gean said about thinking having stopped, it's the notion of taking what is unthought in a lot of these ideas and using them. And within the anthology, there is one notion that comes up a number of times, which is the notion of system, which, unlike some of the more concepts without a future, as it's been imaginatively reformulated by Nicholas Luhmann, and I say this not as somebody who can even use that at the moment, but yet am awed as a science fiction reader by the formulation, which says essentially there are systems in the environment and the humans are part of the environment, but the systems talk to themselves. This is kind of crazy, but it's also far out. And it seems to be at the root of a lot of interesting thought, like Ben Bratton, the stack, for example. So my question is, as Hegelians and Marxists, how can we take that concept, which in the book, for example, is referred to the market, which we have to remember in Marxist term, is not where the action is by any means, but it's in production. How do we take concepts that have been appropriated for a tepid liberalism and try to see how they can be generative within the larger framework of capital and the circus of capital that Marx talks about?
Shelley?
I was kind of hoping Sven would take that up. Yeah.
Sorry.
No. It's been nagging on my mind for the entire time that I've been working with intellectual and manual labor, that the site of action, as Philip puts it, for Sohn-Rethel is the market, whereas the site of action for Marx is the quote unquote hidden abode of production. I know that very well, and I'm kind of laboring under that contradiction. I think I defer to Sven on this one, but I think that what Sohn-Rethel is saying is that these are two places of division that redouble and multiply one another. And that's the difference ultimately between the kind of market economies that predate the capitalist mode of production and the capitalist. And then once, when you read this long history that starts with, 600 BCE and then finally gets up to the capitalist mode of production, what happens is this abstract mode that Sohn-Rethel is tracing, it sort of reduplicates and multiplies. So yeah, I acknowledge there's a contradiction there, but I'm not sure what to do with it. That's my honest answer.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm not sure to what extent this directly relates to Philip's question, but I agree with Jale that this is an important issue, whether the extent to which actually Sohn-Rethel is a theorist of the value form as a transhistorical form, and whether or not he actually then sidelines or does not give sufficient emphasis to the capitalist mode of production. I mean, there are also tensions within the book or the different versions of the book, but yeah, we can't fully unpack that here. Related to, I mean, one way perhaps of at least approaching the question would be to also historicize the notion of the system, right? The rise of the notion of the rise of systems theory after the Second World War in conjunction with cybernetics and what have you. Then we get systems aesthetics and we get systems this and that. Of course, it was in a way the dream of a grand unified theory, at least bringing together the social sciences and the humanities, as well as at least some of the natural sciences, biology, geography, etc. And in that respect, it was also in part a critical response to specialization, right? So in addition to the division between manual and intellectual labor, there is also, of course, the ever progressing further sort of unfolding specialization within within academia. So, okay, here the disciplines or several disciplines could come together sort of under the umbrella of systems theory and having a certain shared idiom and shared conceptual tools such as feedback, etc., and negative feedback and positive feedback and homeostasis. Okay, so there was this attempt at a certain, albeit technocratic, we might say, reintegration. That had a technocratic side, but it also actually accommodated certain esoteric tendencies, right? Somebody like Jack Burnham was certainly also very attuned with the holistic implications of systems theory and systems aesthetics. I mean, he later really became a sort of, you know, a truly esoteric Kabbalah obsessed person. So it appealed in different ways. It arguably also, even though there were attempts to develop sort of a left-wing, possibly Marxian version of systems theory, it also did have a politicizing effect in many respects. But yeah, it had its moment, and then perhaps there was never actually a full critical working through, right? It was actually also then replaced by other trends. But where is, you know, a real critical assessment of systems theory in the 1970s or 1980s? There were critiques, but then basically the whole thing kind of fizzled out, and then it kind of returned also in part because of an interest in art history in certain practices, such as Hans Hake's or Jack Burnham's indeed. And then B, it also returned, I think, largely because of the rise of sort of a new theory of technology that then looked for antecedents. You get contemporary authors such as Yukui, also sort of digging in the archives of systems theory, cybernetics, Simondon, etc. So not limited to systems theory, strictly speaking. There's an interest for sure also in precisely the critical or left-wing versions of cybernetics, right? Project Cybersyn in Chile, Aiden Medina, etc. So there's a whole constellation. Then the question would be indeed, to what extent are we actually now using or re-engaging with this, you know, with this kind of skeleton in the closet, or with this kind of strange kind of ghost, right? This Georges Didi Uberman called Abi Warburg the Dibuk of art history, like some kind of spirit that haunts the discipline, but nobody really knows what to do with him. So what do we do with this Dibuk actually of systems theory? And well, that's probably just me rephrasing Philip's question, but perhaps that rephrasing can also in itself be helpful, because that's also very much the question that one question that I am posing myself now. Yes, I am interested in all that stuff, you know, and I am interested in the Hans Hake of that period and Jack Burnham, but what does my interest actually mean? You know, is it just something that resonates because it allows me to enrich my knowledge of the art and culture and theory of that period? You know, is it sort of a way of expanding my horizon, or is it actually something that I can also work with, that I can put to use, that I can develop? Here I would say there are a few people sort of in the present situation, including the aforementioned Yukui, who at least give me some pointers. And I'm kind of also ending my forthcoming book, which was mentioned, Objections, with that, actually, on that very point. Sorry,
I think we should all read Tikkun's cybernetic hypothesis and reconvene around the panel on that, because that's what it takes up, how we can watch the way in which the warp and weft of the market became tighter and tighter and tighter with the cybernetic turn. But then, you know, we can analyze it, we can historicize it, but then what can we do with it? So that would be a great future discussion.
And you can't have this great line that actually what is at stake is sort of a fight over a monopoly, or a fight against a monopoly on autonomy. So precisely this idea of an autonomous system, right? For instance, the market, or sort of the techno-capitalist system, as something that is autonomous, that is beyond actually human agency, or the sort of interventions of activists, of the people. So a struggle, a fight against the monopoly on autonomy, or at least, or the illusion thereof. That, I think, is one really great encapsulation. Now, that's you know, your applause is for to come. I'm just replicating it.
I think that's maybe a good point to bring this wonderful discussion to a close, though it should, of course, continue. I'll just end with a funny anecdote. Picasso is lunching with the owner of a house in Antibes. He's trying to buy it. He takes the napkin and writes a picture of a check on it and signs it. So that whatever Picasso writes or signs is money. And that jibes with economist Hyman Minsky, who said, everybody is a bank. The only question is getting others to accept the money that you issue. Anybody can issue money. So we'll leave that as a kind of a question for next time. And I want to thank Jelly Monsoor, Gean Moreno, Sven Luhiken, and Johanna Goss for wonderful moderation. And encourage people to tune back in at, is it 4 p.m., Kyle? Or I think it is 4, for Red Nation and Border Town violence. Of course, I should know these things, but look at redmayseattle.org. Thank you very much. Donate to us if you can, redmayseattle.org, or Fan the Flames of Red May GoFundMe. And until later this afternoon, thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you stick around for a second? I wanted to ask you, are we off live or are we still live?